We are going to be diving into relationships and really exploring the question of why are they just so hard? And I was thinking about this earlier today as I was copy editing my book Knowing, which is hopefully going to be released in March of this year. I actually have another book that I want to finish and publish so that Knowing is not my first book. There's something about that I've observed different authors who have had kind of their milestone book, and they will have their milestone book be the first one that they ever publish, and then it doesn't gain the traction, and honestly kind of devastated because they just put all this work into it, and then the second, third, fourth book, which isn't their primary hallmark, does really well. So I want to have another book published before I do Knowing. So I'm going to do that, but all that to say, I was just reviewing some of honestly, I was rereading it and also reviewing some of the notes from my copy editor today. And it made me think as I was reading, there's so many layers and complexities to relationships. And even yesterday, I was listening to the book Letting Go by David Hawkins, and he was talking about relationships and how these negative feelings can really play a large part and a large role in relationships. And as I was considering this, the majority of my book is actually centered around how I went through, by way of a broken relationship, the process of waking up and looking in the mirror for the first time. And as I have experienced that season of my life of really being in the wilderness, is what I like to call it, of really kind of being alone and being isolated and really almost like going out to pasture by myself and experiencing the dark night of the soul with no one around me. Like, I would go to therapy on like a bi-weekly basis and talk to my therapist, but I really did so much work alone. And by way of being alone, I really came to know myself, and I came to understand different truths about God and about the world and about myself. And over the last 2 years, as I've more or less so stopped living as nomadic as I did the first 2 years after my husband left, and after divorce, I found, just by way of being in relationship with my sisters and my parents, and now I have a new man. And so after being single for 3 years, and then now being in close relationship with someone on a romantic level, and then also just my family, I've realized how much relationships do the very thing that I would have to go into the wilderness to pursue, which is to really cultivate looking in the mirror and cultivate a learning about myself. And what I found is that there is so much that is exposed to us about us in relationship. And there's some core elements that I think are really, really important, that almost like we have to agree on about relationships and why they're so hard, because otherwise we think we're an anomaly. I thought that when I got married, no one around me ever talked about how hard their marriage was. And I was 20, so I was a baby, but no one talked about how hard it was. Nobody ever kind of leaned into asking me how it was in a very honest way. When people would ask about their marriage or share about their marriage, it was like, "Oh, work or the kids," but it was never about them too. It was never an honest reflection. I feel like I never once, I can't remember a single time during my marriage where I heard another couple really share the honest to God truth about what was happening in their relationship. And it was only at the very end, when we started kind of going through this period where my husband wasn't sure if he wanted to stay, when I learned that someone else was going through a time where they had separated for, I think, about 6 months, and then they had gotten back together. And I like clung to her. I was like, "Tell me what to do. My husband is thinking about leaving and I don't know what to do. And you've been through this." And there was so much help and care that I was able to receive from her because she was honest. And so what we when we talk on the Knowing Show, the goal is that we're so honest that it's like pulling back the curtain and saying, "Hey, look, this has been my experience. I'm not a clinician, I'm not a therapist. I am not any of those things. I've learned by way of doing, and I'm continuously learning. I want to hear from you. I want you to hear from me, and I want us to hear from others. Because y'all, if we are doing life alone, we are missing it's all the open hand that we could give each other and the companionship and the care. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna read this. I sent it to my dad the other day, and then I read it again last night while I was with him. Dick Van Dyke, if you don't know who he is, he's an actor. He's 99 years old. He was in Mary Poppins as the chimney sweep guy, and just always he's still alive, just the biggest smile on his face. And he's literally 99 years old. I don't know if you can see him here, the shot. Look, he's so old and cute. And he said this: I've made it to 99 in no small part because I have stubbornly refused to give in to the bad stuff in life. Failures and defeats, personal losses, loneliness and bitterness, the physical and emotional pains of aging. Instead, for the vast majority of my life, or rather, for the vast majority of my many years, he says, I have been in what I can only describe as a full on bear hug with the experience of living. I read that and I got chills, and I even now, y'all, if we do not allow for us to pull back the veil on the state of our soul, on the state of how we're really doing, we are fundamentally unable to receive the bear hug that is the experience of living. And the experience of living goes both ways. It's the good things and the bad things. But if we're trying to hide all the bad things, we're inevitably hiding the good things too, because we're hiding. We can't choose to hide only certain parts of us. Either we're hidden or we're not. Either we're in the light, exposed and vulnerable and open and awake and authentic, or we're hidden. We don't get to choose. We don't get to cherry pick. Even though we think we might, we're inevitably always cutting off a part of us. It's like, oh, I want to cut off and hide my hand, but then the rest of my body's twisted a little bit by putting my hand behind my back. And then people are kind of wondering what's going on. So they're never even seeing you fully because something's missing, and they get the energy that they can pick up when you're not fully present. And you know this. You know when you experience someone else and they're kind of hiding something. We all can sense that. And then it takes away from the integrity of the connection in that moment that could take place because we're kind of feeling suspicious of them. Why are you hiding? What are you hiding? And should I be scared? So when we're engaging with people who effectively have closed the curtain and are not letting themselves be fully seen, they're not able to fully experience life, and we're not able to fully experience them. So, by way of us actually pulling back the curtain and tonight talking about why our relationship's so freaking hard, my hope is that we come to be able to experience life more fully. My hope is that we also begin to live life more consciously, more aware, more with intention. When I was 28 years old, when my husband left, and I felt like I woke up for the first time and I started to really be aware of the world. Like, I started to see the colors in the clouds and in the sky in a way that I never had before. I started to actually hear the snow crunch underneath my boots in a way that I never had before. It just felt like I was living asleep. And now I'm awake. But in being awake, we sense the gravity of the pain, but also the gravity of the joy that's there. Like, really, I love that he said a bear hug with the experience of living. So that's a primary goal of why, and also a ramification of doing the work, of having these conversations of why are relationships so freaking hard? What can I do about it? What am I doing wrong? What are they doing wrong? Like, let's speak the truth. Let's look at the truth, and let's choose something better and choose something different than what was modeled for us. So, all that to say, talking about why relationships are so incredibly hard. There's a couple of things that have been really milestones for me. One, understanding the dynamic that I came from in terms of how I was raised. How did my mom and dad raise me to engage with conflict? How did they raise me to engage with relationships in general? What is my relationship like with my dad? What's my relationship like with my mom? What's my relationship like with my siblings, aunts, uncles? What was it like with friends growing up? We have to take time to consider this because that's our baseline. That's where we're starting from. And then when we take into account our college roommate or our new house roommate or our business partner or our life partner, we're all coming from such different, very, very often different starting points. And then we wonder why it's like ships in the night when we talk, and it's like, how did you not hear? How did you misconstrue? And it's so confusing. How did we end up here in this moment so entirely on different pages, so entirely misunderstood? It's because we're starting from two completely different points. It's like two rocket ships that both start at the same kind of launch pad, but one slightly angled a little bit to the right. Well, they're going to shoot off and go completely different directions at some point. Well, imagine how much harder if you're not starting on the same launch pad. You're miles apart. And then maybe you cross over at some point in the ether. But y'all, this is why it's so important, because what we can do when we actually recognize, oh man, that's where I started way back there. Okay, I actually want to change some points about that. I actually want to change the way that I show up and engage with the world, or in this context, relationships. So I'm going to create with intention a new starting point right here, right now, today. So we have to understand what was the starting point, what was the launch pad that we were given and inherited just by way of existing in the family that we did and the environment that we did. So what's the launch point? What was the starting point? And then now that we're conscious of that, now we can be conscious to create a new starting point today and recognize, okay, that's how it was. This is where I am today. This is how it shows up and impacts relationships. So what was the launch pad? What is the current one? How has it actually changed and shifted? What are other core moments and experiences I've had from my childhood up until this very moment? How have other relationships, my marriage that didn't work out 100% had an impact on my today launch pad. So we have a launch pad in the past of the environment and childhood that we came from. And then we have a launch pad today of our current status of, okay, well, where am I today? What's my current status? And analyzing both of those and understanding the dynamics in the past that shaped and informed today, but also the core moments since then to make today's launchpad what it is. If you and I experienced any kind of abuse or experienced any kind of real joy, we're going to be bringing all of those experiences into this current launchpad. And so, a big part of why relationships are so hard is not just the initial childhood experience, but then also a lack of real awareness of our current state, our current baseline. We're not living conscious. We're actually living rather asleep. We're living on these autopilot engagements in the way that we show up in the world. And we haven't taken the time to really consider, okay, what was the past? What's my current? But then what's my ideal? How do I want to engage in relationship? And let's think about it from a business perspective. How do we want to show up to our boss? One of the moments that actually was most formative for me was before I even started my business. I have a branding and marketing business, and we work with founders to develop their brands. But before all of that, one of the most pivotal points for me was when I was, I think, 24 years old, and I had a boss, and I didn't know what a narcissist was, and I didn't, I wasn't privy to all of the gaslighting, all that language that's kind of trending today. But man, it was so hard, and I could not understand her. She was one personality one day, another personality the next day, and she treated you great when she was in a good mood and terrible when she was in a bad mood. And I just could not understand. And because of that dynamic, because of who she was, I had no context. I had never engaged with anyone like that before. So we also have to consider, when we look at why are relationships so hard, we also need to take into account not just the launch pad from the past, not just the launch pad from today, but also, well, what's your personality type? What have you actually personally experienced as well? Like, what makes you you? Because not just what was modeled for us in childhood, not just our personal experience in relationship, but also like the character, quality, and essence of a person, whether they're extroverted or introverted, all of these different dynamics. I really got intrigued with this personality quiz type called the Enneagram. It's ENNEAGRAM, the Enneagram. There's 9 different numbers that represent not just 9 different types, But effectively, in total, you can kind of have different combinations of numbers. And there's a whole math and science to it. So it totals 27 different types of personalities. It's really cool. It's so fun. It's like this little algorithmic pursuit if you ever want to read the book. I actually haven't read the book. I've just read a lot about the tests and taken them, and it's brought a lot of a deeper understanding for me because it focuses on what is the core motivation of a person. Whereas Myers-Briggs, I don't know that one as well, but it's different combinations of different letters. And they represent whether you're intuitive, whether you are more of a thinker, whether you're more of a feeler, whether you're introverted. And based on the combination of numbers, it's how you're perceived by other people around you. Whereas the Enneagram is what is your core motivation? What motivates you? What's your core fear? And that's so, so important because so much of the time we're all making decisions, especially in relationship, based on what we're afraid of, based on the core inner dialogue that we're having with ourselves that honestly really impacts the way that we show up with other people, the way that we show up in business, the way that we show up with our families. And if we don't take the time when we're alone, much less take time to create time to be alone, if we don't take time to think about, well, why did I do that? What am I afraid of? What is the core reason for that decision? What is my real motivation? This is what I consider to be looking in the mirror, like really being honest with yourself. How often am I setting aside the time to really look in the mirror? And here's the thing, like my time in the wilderness after my husband first left, where I really was alone and I wasn't around my family. I wasn't around anyone I loved. I didn't date, my husband was the only person I had ever been with up until that point. And so going out into the dating scene just felt like the wild, wild west. Like I got married when I was 20. I had no idea what to do in the dating world. So I just completely was a hermit. And while I was in that state, I really, really went deep. Jordan Peterson talks about this concept of staring into the abyss, like this black nothing, and effectively going down into the abyss. And he says, like, if you go far enough, you'll get the keys to redemption, like the story of Christ going into the gates of hell and getting the keys to redemption. It's not enough to just look in the mirror, see what you don't like, and be like, oh, darn. No, we actually need to let those parts die. We actually need to go through the death process to then get to the other side for redemption. We have to be willing to look at the honest, hard truth and allow for either moments of silence and moments of isolation to look in the mirror, or allow those moments of conflict with our partner to serve as a mirror and say, why did I do that? Why did I react that way? And get so incredibly curious. So what's a launch pad from our childhood? What was modeled for us? What did we inherit? What's a launch pad today? What are the core experiences in relationship that shape the way that we actually view relationships? What scarred us? What actually is an ideal for us because we had such a good experience? We want to look at the light and the darkness, everything in between. And then also really taking into account, what are my core fears when it comes to relationships? And so often that is reflected in our times of isolation, looking in the mirror, or it's reflected in times of conflict. And so the way that, looking back at my launch pad and how I was raised, we never did conflict. We never, ever did. If we did ever have a fight, my mom would say, oh, it's time to spend time together. And so it was almost like, okay, well, like, let's just stop fighting and let's just get along because we're kind of forced to. And so we never talked about why. We never got to the root of anything. And in so doing, when I got married and there was no one around me that ever was honest about what was going on in their relationship, I thought that we must have a terrible, terrible marriage. There must be something terribly wrong with me. No one else in my life had ever had these issues with me. And so I was so in this very unrealistic world around what conflict was. And, there were various points of unhealth. I don't need to go deep into it. The reality about what was so dangerous in that setting for me was that I had no tools on how to engage in emotional emotional upset. So I didn't know how to deal with my own emotions. I also didn't know how to engage in conflict in a healthy way. And there was no one to talk to. There was no accountability. And there was no, there's something about just almost like word vomiting on people and just gossiping. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about having people that we can really come to as like trusted advisors, people who actually have an ideal that we can come to and say, please help me. I want to grow. I want to know the truth. And so now today, talking about the past launchpad, talking about the current launchpad, what has informed everything to my baseline today. The next question is, what do I want it to look like? And I want to camp out here a little bit because I've really been thinking about I'm considering it like the core tenets of marriage and the core tenets of relationship. And obviously marriage is a higher step, but even when you think about business relationships, when you think about relationships with your mother or father or sister or brother, there's these core elements of what constitutes a relationship that are so incredibly important. Number one is love. And yes, love in business. Love, I learned this in May and it blew my mind. Love, when you look into the Greek word of it, there are 7 different types of manifestations of love. Well, we've only learned like really one when it comes to relationships, and it's romantic love. Or maybe it's like, love you, dude, kind of brotherly, but well, what's the distinction? What do they really, really mean? And so I really went down this rabbit hole back in May and really learned about these 7 different types of love. And, one of the loves is that you actually need to have love for yourself. And I know I've had people kind of fight me on this one, and I fought myself on it too. This whole concept of you can't love others until you love yourself. Someone else said to me, well, no, I know that that's not true because I love my brother. Fair. But if you continue to kind of lean into that concept and you really lean into, well, what does loving your brother really mean? What does it actually look like? The more that this person and I really unpacked love in that context, we actually realized that a lot of that love was actually more so. I mean, yes, there was a love and a loyalty there, but a lot of it was actually predicated in he was meeting his own needs. That's how he felt worthy. That's how he felt like he belonged. So his love and care for his brother was actually just filling a void in himself. Y'all, this is why it is so important to become just so aware of these terms. What does love mean to you? And is your definition of love something that's right and something that you're proud of? I really sat with my definition of love in May, and that's how I stumbled upon these 7 different types of love, because I was really analyzing my marriage or my former marriage. And I was like, how is it that we both loved each other? And then look at what happened and what went wrong and where did it go wrong? And y'all, this is 4 years later, and I was still asking this question because I've looked in the mirror to varying degrees. And this time I was like, I just need to be so honest with myself. What do I not want to see? And what truth is behind the veil? So in pulling back the veil and being so incredibly honest with ourselves, we really come to know not just elements about ourselves, but elements about life that makes us more free to be able to experience it, like Dick Van Dyke says in A Big Bear Hug, experience of living. So as I really came face to face with myself in the mirror, I realized that my love for my husband at one point throughout our marriage actually turned into low-key obsession. I was so obsessed with trying to make him happy and so obsessed with trying to make him love me. And it drove me crazy. I was like, why can't, like, what the heck? I was so baffled. I wrote in my journal, everyone else has liked me until now. Like, what is happening? And so there's so much freedom when we actually start to look in the mirror to see the truth, when we start letting the other person reflect the truth back to us. Because if I had been able to realize, oh my gosh, I'm actually not even loving you. I'm actually obsessed with you. And that's not right. How much could that have staved off a lot of emotional pain and upset by just giving so much of these emotions to him that were frankly improperly attributed and distributed? There's so much to be said for all of us taking radical responsibility to look in the mirror, to allow for the frustrations that we have in our partner, if we have this mindset, and this is so incredibly important, this has to be kind of a commitment to this concept of what does this moment have to say about me? Y'all, that's a hard thing to commit to. But if we're willing to, I promise you that you will come to know so much more about yourself and the world and probably God and probably the other person. Because what's another element here, and this is what I was reading in a book yesterday, is that so often the feelings we have towards somebody else, it's likely somehow being reciprocated. So if you start resenting your partner, they're probably starting to resent you too. But if we're not being willing to be honest and we're ignoring that resentment, and they are too, it's only going to build and build and build and build. And then you wonder why. How is it they're getting divorced 20 years later? Well, it wasn't being addressed throughout the whole time. So if we're willing to square off with the person in the mirror, look at ourselves, and then speak the truth, and speak the truth with love. And this is where those 7 different types of love are really important to just spend time with. What does it actually look like to come back to loving myself? Because otherwise, we're just loving other people. And I say loving with air quotation marks, because am I even being the kind of partner that they want or expected or that they need? Because all I'm doing is using them to meet my own. And that's where it like makes you want to vomit when you see that kind of truth, because it's like, oh my gosh, I did everything I possibly could with what I knew during my marriage. And so there's so much grace for that. There's so much grace for my parents. There's so much grace for your parents, all of whom I'm sure and I hope did the best that they could. And there's so much grace for you for doing the best you could. And so now the question is, are we willing to change now that we know better? Because if we're not willing to change, if we start learning new information and we're not allowing it to integrate in our body and mind and soul and spirit, then now we're actually choosing to remain the same. Now we do have a different type of accountability because we actually have the information. Before, there's an element of innocence. Even if we caused harm, there's an element of like, I literally did not know about what codependency was. Well, now I know. So now there's a higher standard. Now there's a higher bar that I'm being held to, that you're being held to. Now that we start learning new ways of being in relationship that's actually healthy, now our standard raises. So coming back to this question of, well, what do you want your ideal for relationship to look like? And then taking that question and assigning it to relationship with your mother, relationship with your dad, relationship with your partner, relationship in business with your boss or business partner, whoever that is, your employee, and really taking radical account for, what do I want this to look like? And am I becoming the person, and am I the person that would allow for that type of relationship to take place? Because so often it's so much easier to point the finger than to look at the 4 looking back at us. And that's where radical responsibility comes into play, whether it's by looking in the mirror, by crafting time to be alone to do that, or whether it's looking at the conflicts you've recently had with whoever of that list I just shared. What do those conflicts have to mirror back to you about you? So why are relationships so hard? Because there's all this data that we have not been aware of, that we've never been conscious of, because we haven't taken into account the difference of just we approach life differently. We're just different people. What's your personality type? What's mine? Really understanding our core motivations and our core fears. And then also, we don't really actually know what we want. We know what we don't want, but that's not going to help us. We have to set a new target to allow for real change to take place. So with relationships, there's so much freedom on the other side once we actually start speaking the truth, once we actually start taking radical responsibility to look in the mirror and allow for real change to take place.